Hello, my name is Bob Shapiro, and this event, as you can see, is sponsored by New Jersey Society of Professional Journalists, and very graciously, we've received help from the Deadline Club in New York, which is the New York Society of Professional Journalists, from the Newspaper Guild has helped us publicize, and the Center for Media Peace, can't read without my glasses, and Media Peace Initiatives. I'm sorry, the format is we have a very distinguished panel, and they each represent a certain expertise. We will have presenters, basically our rank and file members, some of them better known than others, and we're going to, because who is a journalist is such a large question, and you can approach it from so many different angles. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. Each presenter will be up here for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. We're going to examine one aspect of the question, get into it as much as we want, and then move on to the next. Experimental format, we'll see how it goes. But great panel. I'd like to introduce Peter Szekely. I'm going to look this way if you don't mind. Peter wears a couple of hats. He spent 29 years at Reuters. Right now, he is an officer of two different organizations, one of which is the Deadline Club, which is a professional organization for journalists. And the other is the Newspaper Guild of New York, which, as you may know, represents nearly 3,000 employees at, I think, 19 different papers, organizations. We have Heather Taylor. Heather Taylor, a lot of you know, is kind of the go-to person if you want to. She knows everybody in New Jersey. And if you give her 5 minutes, she knows everything you might ask her. She's from the Citizens Campaign, and I just took that from their website. These are some of the things that are near and dear to them. Seated next to her is Professor Thomas Healy, who is a law professor at Seton Hall. He writes on First Amendment issues, and he also authored a book that I saw it because it got a great review in the New York Times. It's The Great Dissent. It's about Oliver Wendell Holmes back in 1919, but it's really a good book about the First Amendment. And we're going to be hearing a little later from Professor Healy. We're also going to be selling the books. We're going to be selling his book, Jonathan Alter's book, and the proceeds will go to it's going to go to an independent bookseller. Aren't too many of those left, and there's going to be a 10% markup goes to the Montclair Public Library Foundation. At the other end of the table there, Merrill Brown is from Montclair State University. He is director of their new combined School of Communication and Media. Many of you were with us last March when they hosted an event where we helped to unveil their brand new Center for Cooperative Journalism, where many organizations have their offices. They have New Jersey News Commons, if you get that in your email, that's from that school. Hack Jersey, where they had, I think, 80 people spending a 3-day weekend, journalists paired with, not really hackers, but really computer-savvy people. All of this happening at Montclair State. I forgot some of your credits. Also, MSNBC.com, Court TV, The Washington Post. Senator Loretta Weinberg is the state Senate Majority Leader. And there are some of the bills the issues she's concerned with. You know, as a journalist, you always want to be very objective when you have a legislator and not cherry pick which issues you're going to put up on their slide. So I thought, you know what I'll do is I'll just go to the legislative website and I'll just put what you've been the primary sponsor or enacted into law, because that would be very objective. But there were 14 pages of bills that you've been the primary sponsor or enacted into law.
I have 14 pages of Governor Christie's vetoes.
And last, certainly not least, Jonathan Alter. Jonathan, 28 years at Newsweek, best-selling author and historian. That's his current book, The Center Holds. He spoke at another SPJ event last year. He's always there for us. Correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. And you can see the credits, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Monthly. He writes articles. They clamor to publish them. But that's all old media, right? So new media. You see him on The Daily Show. You see him on The Colbert Report. You see him with Bill Maher. And I think it's coming out right now, isn't it, on Amazon? Alpha House is this thing about 4 Republican senators who live together or share a house in Washington. John Goodman is one of the stars. Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury fame. So he's had quite a, what do you do after you leave print? But his most important title in this building, he's a board member of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. Okay, so the question, who is a journalist now? I say we're going to come at it from several angles. You may have something like this in your wallet. You don't need to take it out, but just a show of hands. How many people in their lifetime have ever had a press card in their wallet or a business card that said they were a journalist? Just about everybody in the room. Okay. So what you probably know is, what does this really mean? If there are certain cards you have in your wallet, it means if your car gets stuck, they're going to send a tow truck. Or it means you have credit at Macy's. Or it means, if you're at the Museum of Natural History, you're already a member. What does your press card mean? Well, I think it lets you park in a certain lot in Trenton. But beyond that, it means whatever somebody wants it to mean. It identifies you. If the police officer wants to let you through the police fire lines, he can. If he doesn't want to, that's the way it works. Now, here's another credential that you can earn as a journalist. This is a degree in journalism. This one is a coveted one, to have a degree from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Someone who has such a degree is Jonna Winter. And Jonna is from Montclair. In fact, I learned this week that she is a fellow alumnus of Montclair High School. You may be aware that her case is being adjudicated right now, this past week and into next week in Albany. It is a very important case. It hasn't received as much attention as maybe some others. She got some exclusive information on the Aurora, Colorado theater shooter. Jonna, as of Thursday, Friday, was going to be here. It's her hometown. And she was very eager to come. Fox said she could come. And at the last moment, her lawyers said maybe not a good idea to make a public appearance right now. We can quote her a little bit from her affidavit. And here's the chilling thing. It's not just the current story she's working on that gets affected because she's under subpoena. But she, right now, can't really work on anything. Because while she's under subpoena, as you can read from the affidavit, don't go by what I say, her sources are very concerned. And this is also from her affidavit, that she's not able to do her job simply because she did her job. And I think the most important sentence right there is the last one. She will not violate the bedrock tenets of her chosen profession, and she will not burn her sources. And she cannot talk to us now, but she has promised she will appear in the future, and she said, and tell them I'm going to have a lot to say. I'm going to be talking to her later this week, and I would like to tell her that in absentia, we all gave this, our hometown hero, a round of applause. Now, We're not going to be totally concerned with the press shield law because journalism is not always about law, but it is a pressing issue now. It is something that's, because there may be a federal law, there needs to be a definition of who is a journalist or what is journalism. That's always been a little slippery. Why should I talk to you about law when we have Professor Thomas Healy right here? Professor Healy.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for inviting me to be here today. Although I currently teach law, I used to have one of those press cards in my wallet. I was a reporter for a number of years before going to law school and going into academia. So I'm going to talk to you just briefly about who is a journalist, but more importantly, why that question might matter, apart from getting to park in a special lot in Trenton or having bragging rights. Often, the question of who is a journalist doesn't matter. In general, many of the constitutional protections that journalists rely on to do their jobs do not depend on the First Amendment. The court has generally said that these constitutional protections apply regardless of whether you're a journalist or a regular citizen. So the protections against being sued for libel, they apply regardless of whether or not you're a journalist or you're just an ordinary citizen. Access to things like criminal trials are on an equal basis. Journalists get no special treatment. So in very many situations, it doesn't really matter whether or not you fall under some definition of being a journalist. But it does matter in a few situations, and one of the most important situations is in the context of the reporter's privilege, which, as Bob noted, has become a very prominent issue recently in light of proposals before Congress for a federal shield law. The reporter's privilege, as most of you probably know, gives reporters a privilege against being forced to testify about confidential or non-confidential sources in civil or criminal cases. And it is similar to the privilege that obtains in other areas, such as the attorney-client privilege, or the doctor-patient privilege, the privilege between spouses, or the privilege between a clergy member and a penitent. And in the context of the reporter's privilege, it's incredibly important because without the ability to promise confidentiality to sources, there is a large risk that reporters will not be able to fulfill their function as a conduit of information and as a watchdog on the government. But by definition, this privilege can't extend to everybody, because if it did, then the courts would never be able to get the evidence that they need to try cases. And so we have to, in this one area, we have to draw a distinction between who's going to be entitled to assert this privilege and who can't assert this privilege. And it's a very tricky definitional problem. In part because of this problem, the Supreme Court itself has, thought I had a slide there, has declined or rejected a First Amendment privilege for journalists. In a 1972 case called Brandsburg versus Hayes, the court rejected the argument that reporters have a privilege under the First Amendment. The court acknowledged that news gathering activities are not without constitutional protection, but held that in this context, the media's interest in protecting its confidential sources was outweighed by the public's interest in law enforcement and generating evidence for criminal prosecutions. Now, like most Supreme Court decisions, this one comes with a couple of caveats. The Supreme Court indicated that if prosecutors act in bad faith, or if they try to intentionally disrupt a reporter's relationships with his or her sources, that the reporter might have access to some sort of defense. In addition, there was a concurring opinion by a justice whose vote was necessary to the outcome, who argued that if the information sought by the reporter was so remote and tenuous from the subject of the court case, then that reporter might be able to quash a subpoena for that information. And in light of this sort of ambiguous message from the Supreme Court. They're just in reverse order. A lot of the lower federal courts have in fact recognized a qualified privilege for journalists who are subpoenaed in federal court. In addition, most states in the country have either through statute or through judicial opinions recognized some kind of reporter's privilege. In 40 states, there is a statute on the books that gives reporters a privilege not to testify. In an additional 9 states, judges have recognized such a privilege, and these privileges, they vary in terms of what they cover, in terms of who is covered by the privilege, but in 49 out of the 50 states, there is some privilege for reporters not to testify about their sources, which leaves only 2 entities in our system that don't have a reporter's privilege. Wyoming. Right, so don't go work in Wyoming as a reporter, or be careful if you're going to. And the federal government. The federal government does not currently have a shield law. But the Congress is currently considering a shield law and has been considering this off and on since about 2006. The move toward a federal shield law gained momentum after the Valerie Plame affair in the mid-2000s. And in 2006, there was a proposal in Congress. In 2007, I believe, both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees passed the federal shield law, but in 2009 and 10, the law stalled, in part because of these definitional questions, and in part because of the rise of WikiLeaks, which the government was concerned about protecting. This year, there have been proposals introduced in both the House and Senate to give reporters a privilege in federal court. It's called the Free Flow of Information Act, and the version in the Senate just passed the Senate Judiciary Committee this fall. Now, these 2 proposals are slightly different with respect to how they define who would be able to invoke this privilege. And so I just want to talk to you briefly about the language here, and maybe we can use this as a starting point for our discussion throughout the afternoon about who it is that should be entitled to claim the status of journalists. In the House, the proposal would cover any person who, for financial gain or livelihood, is engaged in journalism. I have highlighted there the words financial gain or livelihood because I think that could certainly be relevant. Somebody who is doing this as a hobby might not be covered under the language of the House proposal. The House proposal then goes on to define journalism as the gathering, preparing, collecting, photographing, recording, writing, editing, reporting, or publishing of news or information that concerns local, national, or international events or other matters of public interest for dissemination to the public. Now that definition is fairly broad and would, I think, presumably cover people who are blogging or engaged in sort of new media activities. But again, there's that caveat about being engaged in this for financial gain or livelihood. Now the Senate proposal is a little more complicated. And has really, I think, 3 main features. The first feature is that the person who's claiming the privilege has to have the primary intent to investigate events and procure material in order to disseminate to the public news or information concerning local, national, or international events or other matters of public interest. So that inclusion of a requirement of intent, I think, is relevant because I think that might exclude people who stumble into this, who post something on their Facebook page, not because they're trying to investigate events or procure material to disseminate to the public, but simply because they had some time to kill in the morning and were on Facebook. The second feature is that the person who invokes it has to be engaged or engaged now or engaged at the time the material was published in the regular gathering, preparation, collection, photographing, recording, writing, editing, reporting, or publishing of such matters. And I've highlighted the word regular because I think that's designed to exclude somebody who once every 2 years maybe puts something on a blog to disseminate information. And then finally, there has to be some sort of connection to an entity that disseminates news or information. You have to work for, or you have to have worked in the past for, an entity that disseminates news or information, and this is defined quite broadly to include newspapers, wire services, websites, magazines, TV and radio stations, book publishers, and film companies. And there's some language in there about when you had to have worked for an entity like this. There's also language in there that would extend this protection to freelancers, and there is also a kind of catch-all provision that would enable a judge to extend the privilege to anybody who didn't technically fall under the language, but who the judge felt was analogous to other people who are covered. Now, this is a federal shield law, proposed federal shield law. Whether it ever gets passed is anybody's guess. But you in New Jersey have the protections of the New Jersey shield law, which fortunately is one of the most protective in the country. It gives you an absolute privilege not to testify in civil cases unless you were the witness to an action of violence or some sort of property crime. And the only instance in which you can be subpoenaed to testify is if a defendant in a criminal case needs your information, it's relevant, material, and necessary to that defendant's defense, and there's no other way to get the information, and the court rules that the balance of interest tips in favor of the criminal defendant. And the New Jersey shield law is quite broad as well. There's a recent decision by a New Jersey court that extended the protection of the New Jersey shield law to bloggers, somebody who was running a blog called, I believe, the County Watchers. And the court held that that blogger met the 3 criteria, that she was engaged in professional news gathering activities, that she was connected to a news entity, which I think was her blog, and the third criteria was that she had the purpose to disseminate news. Last point I want to make about the federal shield law. The federal shield law does not cover a few people who are foreign agents, people who are engaged in acts of terrorism, and it also does not cover, and I think this is very interesting, it does not cover.
Just hit the next slide.
Sorry. Thank you, Bob. It does not cover any person or entity whose, this is the last bullet point, whose principal function, as demonstrated by the totality of such person or entity's work, is to publish primary source documents that have been disclosed to such person or entity without authorization. Now, this is very embarrassing. I put e.g. Wikipedia. I meant e.g. WikiLeaks. Not Wikipedia. I meant WikiLeaks. I should have double-checked this. I noticed this in my notes before I got up to talk. WikiLeaks, basically, this is designed to exclude WikiLeaks or comparable entities from protection under this proposed federal shield law, which I think poses some very interesting questions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gill. So law is a backdrop to our discussion because this is a pending issue, but there are many different aspects to who is a journalist. And our first person to address a question to the panel, you see her picture whenever there's a theater review in the Star Ledger, Ronnie Reich.
Thank you. As Bob said, I specialize in arts reporting, but I think what I come across in this particular niche, I hope, of journalism can have a broader application. As an arts reporter and critic, the question of who is a journalist and who holds credibility comes into play in a few forms. As on other beats, an independent blogger whose free time is devoted passionately to a particular field may be just as knowledgeable and articulate as someone who writes for a long-established publication. I think that calls on all of us, from whichever so-called side of the divide we come from, to focus on maintaining quality reporting, striving for access to valuable stories, and also developing trust and transparency. And that last point brings me to the question of the use of unnamed sources. Writing about arts and culture, using an unnamed source is maybe not as likely as in other fields to save lives or alert the public to threats involving rights or safety. It might not reach the point of legal action. But at the same time, I think there are situations in which, to varying degrees, there's reason for interest of public concern or just public curiosity. So I'll throw out a few scenarios and see what the panel has to say. Attending an arts event or supporting a venue entails a commitment of time and money, whether it's your name on the theater or you've bought a student ticket. If there's wrongdoing at any level of an institution, that can be a public concern. If an organization hires a CEO who turns out to have a criminal past, or if an executive director is accused of financial mismanagement, both of those are stories that the New Jersey arts community has seen in recent years. That affects patrons, artists, and also possibly neighborhood residents. At the same time, the arts community is small, often collaborative, and jobs can be scarce. For an artist or administrator to speak out about problems, whether their own, their colleagues, or their competitors, can be to risk their position and potentially future employment. Is it okay then to use information from people who aren't named to protect their careers? To what extent? There are also matters that I would call more public curiosity, perhaps a rumor that a play is going to transfer to Broadway, something along those lines. People may want to know. Or the relationship details of celebrities, which we see regularly from unnamed sources in places like Entertainment Weekly. So when, if ever, is it okay to use unnamed sources?
Anybody? After a half hour, we're going to let you talk.
Well, unnamed sources are a necessary evil of journalism. It doesn't matter what the realm is, as I think the question indicated, because there can be wrongdoing or questionable behavior or information that can't be obtained in any other way except through unnamed sources. The problem is that it becomes an epidemic if there isn't judgment and editing, and often with blogs, for instance, there are no editors, so there are no checks on the use of unnamed sources. And journalists need to develop their own moral code about their usage, and they're going to be done in different ways. The one rule of thumb I have is no ad hominem attacks from behind a rock. So you can't use an anonymous source to personally attack somebody else. It's just not fair. And it doesn't matter what they may or may not have done, that people have the right to see their accuser. If, however, there is information that needs to be surfaced that could be damaging to the individual, that's different than a quote trashing them. I guess that's what I object to, is an anonymous quote trashing somebody else without them having the ability to know who's criticizing them. But if it's wrongdoing, if there are suspicions of or serious questions that the person needs to answer, then those can be published with the use of unnamed sources. A lot of times you can avoid it by not using quotations. It's the quotations that tend to cause problems, and often quotations are overused in journalism. They become a kind of an unnecessary building block of a story. And instead of a quotation, what you really need is a document or a reference, from somebody else who might have relevant information and is willing to investigate. Whether it's law enforcement or, in the case of take an arts organization that you're talking about, if you find out from an unnamed source that the board of trustees of an institution is investigating the spending of the executive director, of course you're going to use that or should use it if it's obtained from an unnamed source. But if it's Joe Schmo says the executive director, wouldn't know a quality production if it hit him in the face, says somebody who asked not to be identified, that's not cool, at least for me.
I'm just trying to think back to the years I spent as a reporter with Reuters in Washington, and I always tried to not use unnamed sources if I could avoid it, but obviously there are times when you can't. I certainly think that with the exceptions you just heard carved out, I would say there's certainly nothing wrong with using unnamed sources. But I also think that for a lot of reporters, I think using unnamed sources has a certain amount of swagger to it. You use your unnamed sources and you portray yourself as somebody who's very much plugged in. And it almost gives you the kind, it gives you the kind of cachet that you want people to think that you have. And I think in my time and in the news business, I noticed what I thought was an overuse of unnamed sources, that especially when, I don't want to name any publications, the Washington Post, but where they, I remember a story being reported, and it was like, this and this happened, and it was attributed to unnamed sources. And then in about the third or fourth paragraph, the agency later confirmed this. Well, they just wanted you to know that they got it from somebody unnamed, that that they were plugged in. And even though the agency that they were writing about, this news was later confirmed, so it was on the record. They didn't have to go that route at all. But I think there's a certain amount of, as I said, the swagger in using these, and I think that we should, as journalists, really try not to overuse it and only use it when we absolutely have to.
And perhaps when using it, do everything you can, which is actually not the history of these affairs, to identify the nature of the bias or background of the unnamed source in question. Yeah. So when you quote a Republican operative as saying, Obama's doing a terrible job, to pick a simplistic example, it would be valuable to say it's coming from a Republican operative rather than just some anonymous political observer. So I think big papers, big journalism organizations are doing better at that, but historically they don't, and fortunately these days there's at least that level of transparency.
Some of them have rules now. I mean, we, after a flap at Newsweek, which was at the time owned by the Washington Post Company, which was at the time owned by the Graham family, there were rules that were developed, and the New York Times has them to this day, that says you have to indicate something about the nature of the source or why they're asking for anonymity. The problem is in the hard cases where you have to make a choice between using the information and there's a balance or not, and there's a balancing test between those informal rules and the quality of the information. In the public interest, you want the information out, and so that will usually win out. The larger problem, I think, is with news organizations that aren't, it's with non-news organizations like blogs, where everybody's making up their own rules, and we can talk about that later.
Jonathan, can I use that as a segue? Because we're going to stay on the issue of sources.
Senator Weinberg is.
I've been the recipient of telephone calls from reporters who will say an unnamed source told me ABC happened at a meeting, will you confirm it? And I never know whether they're really looking to confirm it or they're just on a fishing expedition to find out what happened.
That's an okay fishing expedition.
Oh, okay.
Because
So
they're
I'll
trying
mark that in my
to
book
do
then.
they're trying to do their job of, it's tough to get information, and so is a little bit of bluffing, is that permissible? I would say yes. For a reporter to make it seem as if, in talking to you, that they know more about that meeting than they really do, in the hope that you're a little indiscreet and tell them something new.
I'm never indiscreet.
I'm-
But anyway,
we're-
I'm glad to know that that's an appropriate action.
Yeah, I mean, it's not appropriate for them to lie to you, but for them to, by inference, like, suggest that maybe they know more than they really do in the hopes of getting some confirmation or some new information. You know, all's fair in love and journalism, that department.
We're going to stay on the question of sources, but approach it from a slightly different angle. Some of you, especially if you're down by the shore, you know the name Justin Ausiello. He created the Jersey Shore Hurricane News, which is very active today and exists on Facebook and Twitter. He'll tell you about that. He was recognized as a White House champion of change, but he is a citizen journalist. That is something, that's a term that we always get a lot of heat at SBJ meetings when we talk about citizen journalists. It means something different to different people. Citizen journalists sometimes use citizen sources. Justin, you want to come on up? And he has a question for the panel.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for everyone coming out. So, Jersey Shore Hurricane News, what is it? Well, I can tell you that it's much more than hurricanes. It was created in advance of Hurricane Irene in August 2011, and unfortunately, or some would say fortunately, the name stuck. Facebook locks your name at 100 likes. This was created on social media. This was created on Facebook. I first jumped into citizen journalism in 2007 when I hopped on Twitter, and I saw how amazing it was that regular people were breaking stories as they were happening. And I started to jump in myself. I started to, in my own town, down in Seaside Park, I started to report car accidents, traffic, fires, etc. And no one was really listening to my reporting on Twitter, of course, but I saw it was fun. I started to blog about new media, and I started to really research new media and the changing media landscape. So in advance of Hurricane Irene, I saw all these rumors circulating on social media, and I said, I'm prepared to create this outlet based on social media. I wanted to create this two-way outlet where regular people, just like me, can report what's going on around them. And I thought, you know what, I trained myself in many ways to be a journalist. I'm going to be the top down. I'm going to be the editor. I'm going to be the filter. And it worked quite well during Irene. After Irene, it transitioned. I said, what am I going to do with this now? Storms are over, but I'm like, you know what, I want to continue this. So I turned it into this real-time news, traffic, and weather platform where regular people can report what's going on around them. Of course, Sandy struck, and when Sandy struck, it became a monumental resource for people in many respects. So my question for the panel is essentially, I deal with citizens and there are over 200,000 people on Facebook and about 6,000 on Twitter, who I consider them contributors. I have over 200,000 sources, and people feed me real-time information all the time. I'm wondering, my question for the panel is essentially, what do you think about using regular citizens for your sourcing?
Your sourcing or as actual journalists?
Well, that's a question for for the panel.
I'll take that. I mean, I think it's incredibly important. Just both as sources, there's people, eyes and ears everywhere, and now with the advent of Twitter, social media, they can share and contribute to the story. I mean, they're going to bring great value to what's happening. They're the boots on the ground. We can't ignore that. And I think what's great about what Justin's doing is that you are bringing them in, but then you're vetting it and you're curating, and that's the big word today is curation. But everyone has a voice. There's a void in our traditional news media, and I see this as an opportunity for citizens to grab on to the social media, to see what's happening, to report in live time. You can use hashtags and really get more subtext of what's happening in a situation. So I think I see you can use sources, and you have to remind you, I believe the public's smart. They can filter out fact from fiction in most cases. If there is like a wild lie, it's gonna get knocked down pretty quickly. I mean, how many times have we seen the social threads of like some celebrity died on social media? Within a couple hours, it's ferreted out as, you know, well, no, that's a lie, that's not true. But valuable information will travel fast, and it will grow, and then more people can come into the process and really contribute to reporting what's happening in their community and ultimately make stronger communities.
I would say it even more strongly and say that in today's journalism marketplace, it's mandatory that we take seriously citizen input and engagement with the right verification accompanying it, and that the journalistic institutions that will thrive in the coming years in the face of all the troubles journalism has are those who, among other things, master this. So I think it's a requirement for success in today's world, not just an option.